A strange man came to my table in the restaurant and said to my wife, "Come to my table, honey." I didn't understand. For a second, my brain refused the information. My mind froze between the trembling steel fork I held and the shy smile she let out. She smiled. Not out of nervousness, but out of recognition. A kind of smile I hadn't seen in years. I looked at her trying to find a silent answer in her eyes, a cry for help, some kind of explanation, but all I saw was that same glow that was once mine. An old glow, which already existed before me. I got up without thinking, with the pounding in my neck and the cold sweat on my back. The stranger looked at me, calm as someone entering home after a long journey. And before I said anything, he said calmly, "Didn't she tell you who I am? I'm the love of her life." I don't remember exactly what I answered. I don't think I answered anything. I sat down again like a defeated man, or perhaps like someone who has just woken up from a dream that was too long. The waiter approached, asking if I wanted anything, and I just asked for the bill. The sound of the cutlery around seemed to mock my posture, my ignorance, my history. I knew this was the end, but I still didn't understand the size of the fall. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed every scene from the last few years, every smile of hers, every touch, every small gesture that now seemed to have a hidden meaning. The way she dressed up for certain last-minute dinners. The absence of comments about the day itself. The empty smiles in the face of my attempts to get closer. The night I arrived with flowers and she said she was too tired. The trips I turned down because of her, the friends I stopped seeing, the life I shaped to fit into the spaces she made available to me. I thought she was sad. I thought it was routine. I thought love had just changed form. But now I understand, love has not changed. He just ceased to exist for me. The next day, I went to the registry office. I asked for guidance on filing for divorce. The attendant asked me, with the delicacy of someone who repeats the same question 100 times a day, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I signed the form with the firmness of someone who lost everything and now wants to at least regain their own dignity. It was at that moment that the penny dropped. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about who I had become because of her. About how I silenced my desires, my voice. And now, for the first time in years, I was willing to scream. She arrived home 2 days later, with a blank expression and a grocery bag in her hand. He tried to act as if nothing had happened. But when she saw my eyes, the suitcase in the hallway, and the envelope on the table, she stopped. And then he said, quietly, almost like a child caught in the act, "You got it all wrong." I walked over and said, "No." I didn't understand until too late. In the months that followed, my life became a process of deconstruction. Friends came forward with stories, little clues that I hadn't seen before. And, little by little, the puzzle came together. I discovered that she and that man had a past that preceded ours. A youthful romance that had never ended, just slept. And while I believed she was just going out to meetings or visiting her mother, she was reliving a story that was never completely buried. The cruelest. She said she loved me. I repeated this in every conversation, even in the face of separation. "I love you, but the way I feel about him is different. It's like it never ended." And there, at that moment, I realized that the deepest betrayal was not physical, but emotional. I was the temporary shelter while she waited for the right hurricane to blow again. I was the substitute. The consolation. And there's nothing more humbling than realizing that all the love you believed was reciprocated was actually just emotional convenience. But it was at the most unlikely moment that life began to give back the pieces it had taken. When I least expected it, when I had already given up trusting, wanting, loving, I met her. A woman who came into my life without warning, at the most unlikely moment, with a light smile and eyes that didn't try to hide any past. She didn't want to replace anyone, just build something from scratch. With her, I started to see the world in other colors, other possibilities. And, ironically, it was precisely when I found happiness again that my ex decided to come back. She knocked on the door, 3 months after the divorce was made official, with a defeated expression. Eyes swollen, hands shaking. He said that the man he had left me for decided to get back together with his ex-wife. She said she realized no one would ever treat her the way I did. That he wanted a second chance. I just looked at her, in silence, and wished, from the bottom of my soul, that she had the same courage that I had, to start again. But not with me. The most surprising? The woman I rebuilt my life with, was someone my ex knew. An old colleague, someone she herself removed from our lives, perhaps out of unconscious jealousy. Perhaps out of fear of seeing in her the reflection of what she once was, and what she never managed to be again. And, upon learning this, his reaction was a mix of despair and fury. But it was already too late. The cycle had closed. And her? She ended up being alone. Alone with her own mistakes, her own choices, her own memories. And to this day, when I pass by that restaurant, I sometimes wonder, what would have happened if I had gotten up and walked away without looking back? Would everything have been different? Or was that moment, as humiliating as it was revealing, the best thing that could have happened to me? Because, at the end of the day, sometimes you have to lose everything, to finally find yourself. And the most curious thing of all is that, the man who destroyed my marriage, would one day ask me for a favor. A favor I never imagined I would have the power to grant. And when that moment arrived, I realized that my greatest revenge would not be to destroy, but to simply continue living. Can you imagine what this favor was? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, romanticize or justify any type of betrayal. All stories are fictitious, created to show, with intensity and realism, how infidelity is capable of destroying lives, families and futures. Get ready to feel, reflect, and never forget. Now settle in. Take a deep breath. You're about to hear a shocking story. Jonathan and Clara were the kind of couple that seemed to have been shaped by the hands of some inspired screenwriter. He, a software engineer recognized in his field, always spoke softly, thoughtful gestures and a loyalty that showed even in his most innocent distractions. She, a literature teacher at a bilingual school, passionate about poetry and the subtleties of everyday life, with eyes that carried stories and a presence that illuminated any space. They had been together for 12 years, 7 of which were married. Their relationship was not the exuberant type, the kind that flaunts kisses and swearing on social media, but rather solid, based on well-designed routines, silent complicity and a mutual admiration that, in the eyes of those who knew them, seemed unshakable. They lived in a large apartment, with generous windows and walls full of books. The home was calm, decorated with neutral tones and details chosen together, like the lamp in the hallway, which Clara had found in a thrift store during their first trip together, or the framed photo of their wedding in the countryside, surrounded by sunflowers, which Jonathan insisted on keeping on the living room shelf even when she said it was tacky. They had a cat called Mel, who slept at the foot of the bed and meowed softly when she wanted affection. On Sundays, they made pancakes. On Wednesdays, they had dinner out. On Fridays, they watched old films with wine and silence. It was like that. Stable. And, to some extent, too comfortable. Jonathan used to say that he loved the predictability of marriage, that routine was his peace after long days in front of screens and codes. For Clara, however, small gestures had symbolic value. A coffee left on the table in the morning, a message in the middle of the day, a note hidden between the pages of a book. Things that seemed unimportant in the eyes of many, but that, for her, kept the flame of care alive. And as much as he tried to show love in his own way, there was one fundamental difference: Jonathan lived in the present. Clara also lived in what could be. She dreamed. I idealized trips that had not yet been taken, dinners in new places, spontaneous surprises that seemed to come from another time. I kept old letters, museum tickets, dried flower petals given on past birthdays. There was a constant longing in her, a search for meaning, for deep emotion, and for the feeling of being alive, not just safe. Jonathan was his port. But sometimes she wished for a bit of rough seas. There were no children, and that was never a problem for either of them. They decided early in their marriage that they would only have it if they felt there was enough space and desire to include a new life. But the years passed, and the two focused on themselves, their own careers and caring for each other. Even the most difficult moments, like when Clara's father passed away or when Jonathan had an anxiety attack because of work, were faced side by side. There was respect. There was loyalty. There was, above all, a shared history that seemed too solid to collapse. And yet, in recent months, something subtle was beginning to infiltrate the relationship. Small voids accumulated between everyday gestures. The attention that was once natural now seemed forced at certain times. Jonathan, although loving, became increasingly absorbed in his work. He spent extra hours at the office, sometimes forgot planned dinners, and when he was at home, tiredness made him silent. Clara, in turn, immersed herself in her books and school projects, smiling less and thinking more. Sometimes they exchanged affection, yes. But it was as if an abyss was slowly forming between their clasped hands. Some friends noticed. They commented at casual lunches that they seemed distant, more serious. Clara justified it with work, with the end of the school year, with late reading. Jonathan just smiled, as if he preferred not to delve deeper into the analysis. They both believed it was a phase. One moment. Something that would pass, like so many other phases had passed. And perhaps it would have passed, if it weren't for the unexpected invitation they received one afternoon, a wedding of former mutual friends, in an elegant restaurant, with a small list and an intimate atmosphere. Clara was excited about the idea. She spent days choosing the right dress, doing her nails, choosing her makeup. Jonathan, even though tired, followed everything lightly, happy to see her excited. And when they arrived at the place, everything seemed like old times, soft music, glasses clinking, people smiling all around. But in that restaurant, with tables set under yellow lights and bowls glistening under modern chandeliers, their lives were about to turn upside down. Not yet at that moment, of course. But something was coming. Something that began to insinuate itself behind crossed glances in the room, footsteps that approached with too much certainty, unspoken names that seemed heavy in the air. Clara, seeing certain people arriving, discreetly fiddled with the promise ring. Jonathan, without realizing it, straightened his tie 3 times in 15 minutes. And there was a tension in the air that neither of them could name. Maybe it was just the environment. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe that was all. But at that moment, there, amidst laughter, toasts and canapés, the two were still together. They were still a couple. They still shared the same roof, the same breakfast, the same nighttime silence before bed. They still didn't know, or pretended not to know, that there was much more than gestures between them. There were gaps. There were untold stories, suppressed desires, and decisions that, sooner or later, would take their toll. Clara, that night, danced twice with Jonathan. At first, they smiled. On Monday, they were silent. When he went to the bathroom, she was alone at the table for a few minutes, looking at the half-empty glass, as if looking for answers in reflexes. And when he came back, there was a man standing there, next to the table. A man that Jonathan had never seen, but who carried in his eyes a past that perhaps Clara had never really left behind. At that moment, everything was still on hold. No gesture out of place. No word said that could hurt. Just the presence. A subtle detail that would remain engraved in memory. Jonathan sat back down, Clara covered her tension with a short smile, and the night continued its course. But something had changed. Something that didn't yet have a name, but soon it would. From then on, the story they had written together would begin to be undone, line by line, until all that was left was the memory of what once was love, and the pain of what should never have been. That night seemed to have ended like so many others when the couple returned from a social event. Jonathan drove in silence, paying attention to the route, while Clara fiddled with her cell phone, disguising concerns that she didn't voice. The radio played soft music, and between turns, she said something about how good dinner was, but Jonathan barely responded. There was a fog between them, an unnamed discomfort that hovered from the restaurant, a feeling difficult to put into words, like an discomfort that starts in the stomach and spreads to the chest. Jonathan had noticed the man standing next to the table, the exchange of glances that were too quick, the way Clara was tense for a moment and then forced herself to be natural. He kept all this in silence, but it slowly fermented inside him. In the following days, the routine returned, but with small cracks. Jonathan arrived home earlier and watched more. Clara, in turn, avoided his eyes with calculated kindness, became more involved in her reading, spent more time in the improvised studio she had set up in the office, where she said she would correct tests or plan classes. Little by little, he began to notice patterns, the cell phone always facing down, messages answered in a hurry and a restrained smile that didn't seem intended for him. One afternoon, as she passed through the hallway, she heard a low laugh coming from the office, followed by an abrupt silence when she noticed her presence. He asked what it was. She said, "Nothing much, just a funny video." He didn't comment, just smiled back and headed to the kitchen. But inside, something was moving. Jonathan wasn't the impulsive type. It never was. He has always trusted people, perhaps too much. Therefore, it took him a while to accept that his intuition could be right. He began to observe in silence, almost like a stranger in his own house. Sometimes I pretended to sleep and noticed Clara getting out of bed and going to the office, returning after half an hour, 40 minutes. Other times, she said she was going to visit a friend, but came back smelling of wine and perfume that didn't go well with a casual meeting. One night, when she lay down next to him, he pretended to be sleeping and she, without realizing it, typed something on her cell phone with a slight smile on her lips. He didn't resist. The next day, while she was taking a shower, she picked up her unlocked cell phone on the table and read a short sequence of messages. Words like, "Yesterday was magical," and, "I miss you," exploded before his eyes. There were no names, just initials. But the pain was instantaneous. Like a blade cutting inside, without anesthesia, without warning. That morning, Jonathan said nothing. He prepared coffee as always, kissed her forehead before leaving for work, but inside something had changed forever. The love he felt was still there, but now covered by a thick crust of pain, humiliation and bewilderment. At work, he couldn't concentrate. The lines of code became spots on the screen, colleagues seemed like distant voices. He spent the entire day trying to understand how he had gotten to that point. What he had stopped doing, what he had neglected, where he had lost Clara. The answer was crueler than he expected. Maybe he hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe loving too much was also a mistake. That week, he didn't come home in 2 days. He said he was traveling for work, but in fact he spent his time in a simple hotel on the outskirts where he could get away from it all. I needed silence to think, time to digest the pain. On the third night he returned. Clara welcomed him with a soft smile, hugged him with an almost cruel naturalness, as if everything was exactly as before. Jonathan returned the gesture, but inside, his heart was already moving away. It was like watching a play he no longer believed in, but still needed to perform. It became more strategic. He saved the messages he read, printed some conversations he managed to access from the computer's backup, took discrete photos of times and departures. Not for revenge, but for self-protection. I wanted to understand the scale of it all, to know who I was dealing with. It was then that he decided to look for her at work, on a day when he knew she would only have half a day. He invented a doctor's appointment and, upon leaving the building where she taught, he saw Clara getting into a car that didn't use an app. The man in the driver's seat was no ordinary stranger. It was the same one he had seen in the restaurant, the same one whose eyes recognized Clara with such certainty that he dared to call her, "honey," in public. This was not an adventure. It was something old, intimate. Clara got into the car without hesitation, like someone returning to a place they already know by heart. Jonathan followed them, his heart racing, his hands sweating on the steering wheel, and a lump in his throat that seemed to grow at every corner. He saw them enter a small, discreet cafe on a quiet street. They sat close together, facing each other, smiling like teenagers. At one point, she touched his hand across the table. The man looked her in the eyes and said something that made Clara laugh. Jonathan photographed everything from afar, but it wasn't for the evidence. It was for confirmation. For the almost masochistic need to see with his own eyes that the woman he loved was there, whole, given, to someone else. When he returned home that night, he felt like the floor no longer belonged to him. And for the first time, he seriously thought about leaving everything behind. But he wasn't that kind of man. He decided that if everything was going to fall apart, let it fall apart in a dignified way. Let him be the one to put an end to it. What's more, he wanted her to know that he knew. I wanted to see the astonishment, the discomfort, the shame in her eyes. Later that week, Jonathan invited her to dinner at an elegant restaurant, saying he wanted to remember old times. Clara seemed surprised, but accepted it lightly. She spent the day getting ready, choosing the right clothes, the right perfume, the right makeup. When they arrived at the restaurant, they were greeted with champagne and a candlelit table. Jonathan remained serene, polite, almost loving. He talked about memories, told old jokes, complimented her appearance. Clara was relaxed, perhaps relieved to see him back. It was then that everything changed. A man suddenly appeared, approaching the table with firm steps. Jonathan didn't see him coming, as he watched Clara laugh at something she had said. When he noticed, it was already too late. The man stopped in front of the table, looked at Clara and, with the calmness of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, said in a low but firm voice, "Come to my table, my dear." Jonathan froze. The world around fell silent. Clara opened her lips, unable to make a sound. Jonathan stood up slowly, looked at the man with eyes full of everything that had been stuck in him for weeks, and asked, "I'm sorry, who are you?" The man didn't hesitate. "Didn't she tell you who I am? I'm the love of her life." It was enough. Jonathan sat back down, with a cold smile. Clara looked at him, between guilt and despair, but said nothing. The other man remained standing, waiting. Jonathan asked for the bill. When it was brought, he signed calmly, left the tip, and said, without looking at Clara, "I hope it's worth it." He got up and left. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't beg for explanations. The pain was there, tearing inside, but so was the pride. That night, he slept elsewhere. The next day, he contacted his lawyer. She tried to call, sent messages, but he didn't respond. The betrayal had been revealed. What he didn't know yet was that there was something bigger, deeper, that Clara was hiding. A secret that would make everything even more painful. And it would only come to light when it was impossible to go back. Clara appeared at the door of their old apartment a week after the official divorce signing, holding a cardboard box in her arms and with a look that Jonathan no longer recognized. There was no makeup or elegant dress, just a wrinkled hoodie and dark circles under her eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. When he opened the door, he remained silent for a few seconds, analyzing her gesture, the weight of that late visit. Jonathan said nothing. He just stepped aside and gave way for her to enter. The box was placed on the table and, for a moment, neither of them knew what to do. The air felt heavy, time suspended. She then took a deep breath and began to speak, bluntly, as someone who understands that there is no more room for half-truths. He said he needed to return some of his books, which he had found at the bottom of a closet, and that, there was something he deserved to know. Jonathan remained still, his eyes fixed on her. Not because of the contents of the box, but because of what came next. Clara hesitated, touched her hair, sat on the sofa with her hands clasped together. He remained standing. She looked at him for a few seconds and, with a choked voice, said that man, the same one from the restaurant, hadn't just appeared by chance. He was not a figure from the past, nor was he someone who appeared to mess up their lives. The truth was deeper, more raw, more unacceptable. Jonathan frowned, feeling his heart speed up like an alarm before the inevitable collision. Clara revealed that the man was called Daniel. That they had met as teenagers, that they had an intense, forbidden, brief and devastating love. But the relationship ended abruptly when she, just turning 20, discovered that he was married to a first cousin, newly mother of a baby. She walked away. He repressed the feeling. He buried that story under layers of shame and frustration. And for many years, she believed she would never cross paths with him again. When she met Jonathan, she felt security, peace, a new chance. He loved it, built it, shared it, but part of it always remained unfinished. Jonathan listened to everything with his jaw tense, his hands in his pockets, as if trying not to fall. Then came the final blow. She confessed that Daniel had reappeared just over a year ago. That he had separated, that he looked for her, and that the reunion was inevitable. At first, he resisted. He tried to ignore the messages, the emails. But when she finally saw him, something inside her reset. She wasn't honest with Jonathan because she didn't know how to be honest even with herself. He said that what he felt was not blind passion, but an inexplicable attachment, something that was always there, latent, surviving between the cracks of time. Jonathan took a step back, as if his body refused to listen to what his mind already understood. But that wasn't all. Clara, with teary eyes, added. She and Daniel had met again long before dinner at the restaurant. Long before Jonathan even suspected anything. The truth, the one she had kept from everyone, even herself, was that Daniel had been part of their past. Jonathan finally asked. Like this? She swallowed hard. She said that Daniel had been invited by her, years before, to dinner at her house when Jonathan was on a work trip. He said he introduced him as an old friend from college. That the two had dinner together, and that he, Jonathan, never suspected anything. Jonathan, amazed, tried to search his memories for any trace, any clue, but nothing came. She then looked deep into his eyes and said that this wasn't just the first visit. Jonathan felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. He asked, almost voicelessly, if she was saying that she cheated on him at home. She nodded silently. He said that Daniel was there once, in his absence, and that it was that night that everything started again. That she knew she would never be able to confess, and that's why she spent the following months trying to save what was still between her and Jonathan, trying to bury that mistake again. But he couldn't. And the more time passed, the more guilt mixed with passion. Jonathan then lost control. He asked why. He asked how she could. He said that he gave everything, that he built everything alongside her, and that he never, not for a second, allowed himself to love another person. She replied that it wasn't a lack of love, it was the presence of something that never died. But then came the revelation that ripped the last bit of ground from beneath Jonathan's feet. Clara looked at him, now standing, hands shaking, and said there was something she never told anyone. That she and Daniel had never really broken up, not even before she met Jonathan. That, in the first months of dating Jonathan, she still exchanged messages with Daniel, that he was the hidden voice in sleepless nights, the name that she never dared to utter. And, worse, when she decided to marry Jonathan, she knew that Daniel was still waiting for her. That they had met again a week before the wedding and that, in that meeting, she hesitated. He said he almost gave up on everything, but in the end, he decided that Jonathan would be his logical choice. That would be safer. More stable. But the heart never stopped bleeding for Daniel. Jonathan sat on the floor, hands over his face, trying to control his breathing. He felt that every moment they lived, every gesture, every memory, was now contaminated by something that he could never erase. The entire marriage, from the beginning, had been built on false foundations. He hadn't just betrayed the present, but the past, the vows, the birthdays, the plans. Jonathan remained silent for several minutes, staring at the wall, as if expecting to wake up from a nightmare. When he finally spoke, it was only to say, "You chose to live with someone even though you loved someone else. That's not love, that's cowardice." Clara tried to get closer, but he raised his hand, stopping her. He said there was nothing more to be said. That the worst part of betrayal was not the physical act, but the lie sustained over the years. That having been someone's plan B in life was the cruelest of pains. Clara cried softly, sitting on the sofa, hugging her knees. Jonathan got up, opened the door, and before asking her to leave, he said that he hoped that the love of her life was willing to rebuild her, because from now on, he wouldn't take anything of that with him anymore. She left without saying anything else, leaving behind not just the box on the table, but an entire story now reduced to shards. Jonathan stayed there for hours, alone, breathing heavily and the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock. And yet, even with his heart broken, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea that would change everything. Because destiny hadn't finished writing this story yet. 3 months have passed since that afternoon when Clara revealed the whole truth. 3 months in which Jonathan rebuilt every piece of himself without knowing exactly where to start. The words she left hung in the house like fine dust, accumulating in the corners of memory, impossible to sweep away. He sold the apartment. I could no longer stand the sound of the door creaking as it opened, the smell of the closet, the objects they had chosen together. He moved to a smaller loft, further away, quieter, where no one knew his name and where he could walk barefoot without tripping over memories. He installed new curtains, took only the books that were his and even changed his phone number. She walked away from anything that could bring Clara back, mutual friends, places they frequented, routines that reminded them of the couple they once were. And yet, sometimes, it appeared in the most banal details, in the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, in a song on the radio, in the reflection in the mirror when waking up. Jonathan did not seek revenge. That kind of impulse wasn't his. But he also didn't forgive. He didn't respond to messages, ignored calls, deleted emails without opening them. His world no longer had room for the past. I was focused on surviving the present. It was then that the unlikely happened. On a gray autumn afternoon, while waiting to be seen at a new doctor's office, where he had scheduled a cardiological evaluation after recurrent episodes of palpitations and insomnia, he caught sight of a woman sitting in front of him. She was reading a book with an orange cover, her hair tied up in an unassuming way, glasses slipping down her nose. The kind of beauty that doesn't shout, but invites. When she looked at him and smiled, something inside Jonathan gave way. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid. It wasn't desire he felt, nor rush, nor need. It was just a sudden, quiet recognition that life was still capable of surprising. Her name was Elisa. Nurse at a children's hospital, divorced for 2 years, mother of a 6-year-old boy. She didn't try to impress him or hide. He told his story without flourishes, without victimism. I had gone through different pains, but no less profound. And that's why, perhaps, they understood each other with disconcerting speed. The meeting started to happen naturally. First short coffees. Then long dinners. Walks in the park, late-night conversations, exchanging messages without the anxiety of an immediate return. Elisa didn't want to cure Jonathan. I wanted to meet him. And that made all the difference. With her, he didn't need to be strong all the time, nor hide the pieces still sticking together. She listened. It played slowly. I laughed with him, but I also knew when to silence. And so, without forcing time, Jonathan began to experience a peace that he no longer remembered what it was like. It was a fresh start. Not a replacement. Elisa didn't fill Clara's place, she made room for a new chapter, written with fresh ink. It was just when Jonathan was beginning to believe that the past had finally calmed down that the unexpected happened. One rainy morning, while helping Elisa tidy up her apartment, she heard a knock on the door. She went to answer it, and he continued folding clothes on the sofa, distracted. He only realized something was wrong when he heard her tense voice calling his name. When he approached the door, he saw Clara standing there, soaking wet, holding the bag strapped tightly and with her eyes wide open when she saw Elisa beside him. Jonathan remained silent, surprised that she knew where to find him. Clara cleared her throat, looked away and said she needed to talk to him. Elisa looked at him, understanding immediately, and walked away without asking questions. Clara entered, panting, as if she were running away from something, not someone. And he got straight to the point. She said Daniel had left her. That, after 3 months of back and forth, promises and sweet words, he had disappeared without explanation. That she discovered, shortly afterwards, that he had returned to his ex-wife. He said all this bluntly, without trying to justify himself. Jonathan remained with his arms crossed, listening. He said he didn't understand why she was there. That he saw no point in reviving what had been destroyed with such cruelty. Clara then revealed the real reason. It wasn't to ask for forgiveness. Not even to go back. She wanted him to know that, in the last conversation she had with Daniel, he had said something that wouldn't let her sleep. And Jonathan needed to hear that. Daniel, before leaving, told Clara that he had approached her years ago on a pure whim. He sought her out because he wanted to get revenge on his ex-wife, to show that he was still wanted. That when he found out that Clara had gotten married and moved on, it awakened an unhealthy obsession in him. And behind the reunion there was a bet made between friends, a dirty game that involved winning back the love of youth, to prove that he still had power. Jonathan was silent for a few seconds. Clara cried. She said she felt like an idiot, used, destroyed. And that the only man who truly loved her in her life was there, in front of her, with another woman. Jonathan took a deep breath, looked at her with compassion, but not tenderness. He said he was sorry for her, but now, he also had something to say. He said he had found a peace in Elisa that he never had. A calm that did not come from the absence of problems, but from sincerity in relationships. He said that with her, every word was true, every gesture spontaneous. He said there was no more room for shadows. That Clara's time had passed. She tried to get closer, stretched out her arm, but he backed away. He said he was no longer the same man. That pain changed him in ways she would never understand. And that, if she was there, it was only because she deserved to hear that the love she discarded was now flourishing elsewhere. Clara left the apartment with slow steps. And Jonathan closed the door with the lightness of someone who finally closes a chapter. He returned to the living room and found Elisa stirring the tea, as if nothing had happened. She looked at him and asked if everything was okay. He replied that now, yes. For the first time in a long time, everything was exactly where it should be. And there, in that moment, between the smell of mint and the sound of fine rain on the window, Jonathan realized that destiny sometimes has a more precise sense of justice than any planned revenge. Because nothing hurts more than seeing the love you despised blossom in the hands of someone else, someone who chose to move forward instead of drowning in the past. And this, perhaps, is the rarest and most precious kind of justice. The months that followed that last conversation between Jonathan and Clara were quietly transformative, but not in the obvious sense of overcoming or instant happiness. What was established was a kind of painful emotional maturity, made not only of the reconstruction of the days with Elisa, but of the real understanding of everything that had been broken before. Jonathan went on with his life, yes, but each step still required caution. He learned that moving forward was not forgetting. It was learning to live with the shrapnel and still keep moving. Elisa understood this almost intuitively. She didn't pressure him to smile all the time, nor did she ask for more than he could offer. She built alongside him, with subtle gestures, a new form of security. He didn't demand promises, but he offered presence. And perhaps that was exactly what Jonathan needed most, someone who loved him not despite his pain, but because he had lived it and learned from it. At that stage, he decided to change his professional field. He felt he needed to break up not only with Clara, but also with the version of him that existed while he was with her. He gave up the position he had held for years and started working in freelance consultancy, dealing with smaller projects, closer to people. It was something that left him less overwhelmed, with more flexible schedules and mental space to think, to care, to breathe. Elisa encouraged him, but without empty praise. It just said that he was rediscovering something that was his from the beginning, something that Clara had, perhaps unintentionally, erased over the years, his sensitivity. It was in this new context of life that an unexpected invitation arrived. A childhood friend of Jonathan was getting married and really wanted him to be present at the ceremony. There would be few guests, it was something more intimate, in a remote country house, surrounded by flower gardens and starry nights. Elisa loved the idea of a short trip. Jonathan hesitated for a few days, but in the end he relented. He knew that part of the healing process was returning to spaces that were previously scenes of painful memories, and rewriting them with new experiences. When they arrived at the cottage, the atmosphere was welcoming. The host couple welcomed them with sincere smiles, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt at peace even among strangers. The dinner on the eve of the wedding was outdoors. Tables decorated with candles and lavender, instrumental music in the background, whispered conversations between sips of wine. Jonathan and Elisa were talking to another couple about travel, when, on the other side of the garden, a familiar figure appeared. Clara. She was accompanied by a blonde woman, about 10 years older, who they later discovered was the bride's sister. Jonathan froze for a second. I didn't expect to see her there. Much less in that situation. Elisa noticed his tension and lightly touched his hand. He composed himself. There was nothing more to be said between them, but her presence there awakened something that he believed he had overcome, the discomfort of seeing her in another environment, surrounded by people, pretending to be normal. During dinner, they avoided eye contact. But the next day, at the ceremony, they ended up bumping into each other in the hallway that led to the event hall. It was a brief, almost casual moment, but Clara stopped. Jonathan too. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at him for a few seconds as if trying to decipher a reflection. He was the first to speak. I just said, hi. She responded in the same tone. They stayed there for a few seconds in silence, until she asked if he was okay. Jonathan honestly said yes, and that he hoped she was too. Clara smiled, a sad smile, and said she was trying. He said, without many details, that he had started working in another state, trying to get back on his feet. He didn't apologize, he didn't make promises. He only shared a brief version of what he had become since the last time they saw each other. Jonathan thanked him for the words, and said that he was also trying to live now more truthfully. She nodded. And, before leaving, she said that time had shown her the difference between love and attachment. That I learned too late that love is not about wanting someone who makes you feel alive, but about choosing who makes you feel at peace. Jonathan listened. And at that moment, he realized that he no longer felt angry. No regrets. He just felt a strange kind of pity, not for her, but for what the two of them could have been and weren't. On the way home, Jonathan and Elisa talked about the meeting. He told her everything calmly, without filters, and she listened with the patience of someone who understands that no one enters a new relationship whole. She said she was proud of him for being able to face the past without running away. That, for her, was courage. Jonathan held her hand tightly, not like someone who needed it, but like someone who wanted to be there. And that was an essential difference. What they built together was not born from the absence of pain, but from the daily choice to share life with sincerity. The following week, something even more unexpected happened. Jonathan received an email from Daniel. The subject line was short, sorry. In the body of the message, he said that he knew he had no right to write, that perhaps it was too late for anything. But I needed to ask for forgiveness. He said that he had done everything out of ego, that he took advantage of Clara's fragility and Jonathan's routine to infiltrate back. He said that, deep down, he never loved her as he thought he did, and that everything that happened only served to reveal how empty he himself was. He admitted that he had been amused to see Jonathan react with so much dignity, and that it had made him rethink the kind of man he himself had become. Jonathan read everything in silence, reflected for hours, and in the end, responded with a single sentence: "May you find within yourself what you destroyed in us." Jonathan never heard from Clara or Daniel again after that. Elisa became increasingly present in his life. And it didn't take long for the two to start thinking about sharing a new home. But, unlike before, now there was no rush, no grandiose plans. Just the desire to be together. Every gesture, every choice, every new habit, everything was constructed with lightness. They decorated the house little by little, with items chosen by both, avoiding repeating past patterns. Sundays now tasted like hot coffee and slow conversations. The silences were no longer uncomfortable, but comfortable. Intimacy grew not through the absence of conflict, but through transparency. One night, as they looked together at the sky from the balcony, Jonathan commented that he had never imagined that true love could be born after destruction. Elisa responded that sometimes you have to go through the fire to understand the value of reconstruction. And there, at that moment, between the smell of jasmine and the light breeze that crossed the night, he knew he was no longer carrying any weight. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Because true redemption didn't come from seeing someone else lose themselves, but from finding oneself. And that, finally, he had achieved. Time passed without haste. The seasons changed one by one, and with them, the layers surrounding Jonathan fell away, revealing a man who, although injured, had become more whole. Life with Elisa was not a fairy tale, it was real, built on the rubble of other lives, with sincerity and conscious choices. They learned together to respect silences, to deal with the traumas that occasionally reappeared like ghosts on rainy nights or in deeper conversations. Elisa knew all the scars he carried and, unlike Clara, she never tried to hide hers. Jonathan, in turn, learned that love also meant making space for someone else's pain, without trying to fix it, just being there. The complicity between them turned into a serene love, where there was no room for empty promises, only for the truth, naked, raw, and yet beautiful. A year after the wedding that unexpectedly brought Jonathan and Clara back together for the last time, a new celebration was approaching, now, theirs. A simple dinner, surrounded by friends, family and Elisa's son, who saw in Jonathan much more than a stepfather. He saw a man who knew how to listen, who played video games with him, who taught him how to fly kites and who made him laugh on Monday mornings. Jonathan had unknowingly become what he always wanted to be, someone who creates peace. And that was the greatest gift that time could give him. But in another part of the city, Clara lived in a small, rented apartment, where the walls seemed too narrow to contain the echo of her choices. Working as a substitute teacher at a school that paid little and demanded a lot, she had lost the sparkle she once carried in her eyes. The recognition that previously came from students, friends, and social life, now gave way to silence and absence. She tried to renew old friendships, but realized that many of them had gradually drifted away, perhaps because they no longer saw themselves in her, perhaps for fear of repeating their history. Clara, for the first time in her life, was forced to live with herself. With the image in the mirror, with the emptiness in one's own chest, with the regrets that knocked on the door in the middle of the night. There were no more distractions, no more promises, no more loves to hide behind. There was only her. And the certainty that he had everything and chose to throw it away. One gray afternoon, sitting on a park bench, Clara received a call. It belonged to Daniel's ex-wife. At first, he thought about not answering, but curiosity got the better of him. The woman spoke with cruel serenity. He said that Daniel had returned home for a while, but that he never managed to be the same after Clara. She said he was frustrated, aggressive, and became someone she no longer recognized. Finally, he said that he had been arrested for embezzling funds from a company where he worked. Clara hung up in silence. He didn't cry. He wasn't surprised. He just felt his body weigh even more. It was as if everything she had tried to hide for years was now crashing down on her with silent violence. That night, for the first time, he wrote a letter. Not for Jonathan. For herself. A letter of confession, of liberation, of farewell to everything that one day tried to support with lies. And when he finished writing, he burned every sheet. And for the first time in a long time, he slept without dreaming. Jonathan and Elisa got married in a small ceremony, among trees and hanging lights, with light music and sincere hugs. There were no excesses, no formalities. Just true. Between the vows, Jonathan said that he would never again promise perfection, but rather presence. That would not guarantee not to make mistakes, but that would be transparent. That, above all, he would choose Elisa every day, not because he was afraid of being alone, but because he wanted to be with her even when the world became difficult. And she responded with a smile and a short sentence, but one that resonated like an anchor: "You found me when I had already given up on being found." That night, they danced under the moon, not as those who forgot the past, but as those who survived it. In the following years, Jonathan became an even more present man. He assumed the role of father naturally, following Elisa's son's growth with the care of someone who knows the value of small things. He never forced a role. It was just there. On birthdays, on school exams, on knee injuries, on conversations about first love. Elisa, in turn, returned to university to complete a postgraduate degree, encouraged by Jonathan. And together, they bought a house far from the city, with a garden and a hammock on the porch. Not because they sought isolation, but because they understood that the good life is not the most full of people, but the most peaceful. Clara, on the other hand, only reappeared once. She sent a short, emotionless message, saying that she had moved to another country, where she would try to rebuild her life away from the eyes that knew her. Jonathan read the message without any reaction. He didn't respond. He just wished, within himself, that she could finally deal with the choices she made without harming anyone else. There was no longer any grudge, but there was also no room for return. Years later, when Jonathan was invited to speak about new beginnings at a conference aimed at divorced people, he began his speech by saying that love doesn't die. He transforms. He said betrayals destroy not just homes, but identities. That rebuilding yourself is possible, but it requires courage to look in the mirror and admit that loving is not always enough. And that, sometimes, the greatest proof of love is letting the other go, to find yourself. He received a standing ovation. And when he came down from the stage, he found Elisa in the audience, holding her son's hand, now a teenager. And at that moment, he understood that all the pain he had experienced had prepared the ground for this, a simple life, full of meaning. And so the story ends. A story of fall, destruction, pain, but also of rebirth, of true choices, of love that is not noise, but shelter. Which is not a flash in the pan, but a constant flame. Jonathan didn't beat Clara. He didn't get over Daniel. He beat himself. And that is the greatest of victories. If you made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. We want to know your opinion, your vision, what marked you most about this narrative. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that, like this one, will stir your emotions and make you reflect deeply. And remember, this channel never supports any type of betrayal. All the stories here are fictional and serve to show how disloyalty can irreversibly destroy lives. Until the next story.